Hi, Brant Cooper here. I'm fortunate I get to travel around the world speaking with startup founders, investors, ecosystem developers. I've learned a lot in my travels. I've got some stories, and I have some thinking that I love to share. Welcome to Brant's Rant. I want to talk a little bit today about the concept of diversity, but I want to take a little bit of a different angle on it. It tends to be, or has been at least in the past, a difficult subject for many because you start getting into this idea that people are being chosen not because they have the abilities or the best abilities, but because of who they are, based upon the way they look or where they're from or the way they talk. All of these things that fall under that umbrella of diversity. And I want to challenge a couple of ideas and let me know what you think. So I want you to forget about the differences that we have superficially, and think about the world that we live in. Think about the complexity of trying to create products and services for the huge variety of people out there in the world. So my take is sort of that this complexity, the fact that we're trying to build products and services for the edge of the economy. We're all walking around with computers in our pocket, and it means that the disruption or the innovation that we might do on the edge doesn't require a ton of technology innovation. What it requires is to solve the real needs of individuals and of groups of individuals. And so that's one factor. And then the other factor is often there's these transformation layers that need to be underneath the products and services that we're building that makes understanding both the market side and the product side often it's complex. And so like one individual can't hold all of the context required in order to create sophisticated products and services for, regardless of whether it's for consumers or businesses. The ability to create a functioning business is complicated and requires this greater context than us as individuals can build. And so there's a guy here in San Diego, Woody Zully, who is one of the founders of the concept of mob programming. And to me, this is an example of where we are with complexity. 4 or 5 people, almost like a small agile team, will sit around one computer and they program as one. And there'll be one person coding and others that are giving advice, and they all have these different roles they play, and then they'll switch up those roles. But the idea is that each one of those people is bringing sort of a different part of the context to developing this product, or even this portion of a product. And the same thing really can be said on the marketing side or the sales side or anywhere else inside this business model, that it's sort of been proven. There's the examples of physicists that solve chemists' problems, and it's because smart people that are in related but not the same domains can actually see things and point things out that are helpful in this larger context. And so, if one kind of buys that, then what makes that context more accurate? What makes that context fuller? So there's an old Indian parable, which is the 7 blind men and the elephant. And you have 7 very like-minded, not diverse people that are blind, and they're groping this elephant, and they get in this fight because they don't agree with what this creature is, and each of them is essentially arguing that the creature is whatever it is that they're touching, and so they think that the others are lying, and they get in this fight. So that's actually the parable. Sort of the positive, agile spin on this might be that instead of arguing, they're sharing the information, and so if you think about even sharing that sort of information about the elephant that they're touching, I would I would I would think it's safe to say that if you had a diversity of experiences, a diversity of knowledge, a diversity of background, a diversity of thinking, like say an artist versus an engineer versus a salesperson, right? All bringing value to it, but having different ways of looking at things and different ways of thinking. It would seem to me that it would be fairly obvious that if you had those seven blind people that were groping the elephant, and if they had this diversity of experiences, they would be more likely to come to a conclusion if they were working as a highly functional, autonomous, self-organized, agile team. It would seem reasonable to me that they would be more likely to come up with a better description, a better guess of what the animal is, a better representation of that animal if they wanted to share it with others, and that diversity actually brings that to the table. Well, so if we want to seek that sort of diversity, different experiences, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, then it would seem to me that our traditional way of viewing diversity would be a great proxy for finding diversity for that team. In other words, by actually looking for people that look differently than us, that have different backgrounds, different educational abilities, come from different areas, think differently. All of these things that we sort of reject when some people are rejecting diversity, all of these things that get people like worried, those are great proxies for the requirements of a high functional agile team. It's a great way to go and find diversity and a fairly easy way of doing it. So why not do it? Well, so that's sort of like major point, right? The diversity that we need in order to solve complex problems in a complex world requires diversity, and the diversity of gender, skin color, economic background, geography, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these things a broad diversity actually helps us create better products and services for more people. I fundamentally believe that. But so don't make the argument based upon the way they look. Make the argument based upon the diversity that's required in order to come up with these better products and services for more people. I think that the second part of this is that people tend to view abilities and who's right for a job based upon a continuum. In other words, if you're qualified to be, a manager of some level, and it's based upon your experiences, we tend to think that somebody that has more of particular experiences is therefore more qualified. Like, so that you sort of pass this level of what the job description is, and then the people that are further past the job description are more right for that position, are better for that position than people that are less far past that point of description. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, and it's wrong for multiple reasons. But reason number one is that requirements are a threshold. It's not a continuum. And so once you've passed that description, assuming it's a good description, once you're past that, then being more past it doesn't make you better at it, a higher candidate. All of the candidates are equal once they go past the threshold. So we teach in my lean innovation stuff, we teach about the minimum viable product, and the minimum viable product is the same idea. So the minimum viable product is you have the minimum number of features in a product that makes the product viable because a customer is willing to pay for it because it solves a need, right? And so if it solves the need, if you have the number of features, then adding more features or doing those features even more better past that viability need doesn't make the product better. In matter of fact, it can make the product worse. Once you get past that threshold, you might be adding qualities that hurt the viability of the product. So we want to think about the requirements of individuals and roles in the same way. It's a threshold, not a continuum. I think it was in the 90s, it may have been the early 2000s, when the US Navy decided that they were going to hire pilots from Ivy League schools only. And they really wanted just the top of the top. And so they started recruiting there, and they successfully got the top of the top. And these people were highly intelligent and highly functional and highly ambitious, and had all of these qualities that one would normally believe would make them great pilots. And I have no reason to believe that they weren't great pilots. But what's interesting is the Navy couldn't keep them in the Navy. And so the conclusion that they drew was that it was the wrong segment to be recruiting to be pilots, because even though they made great pilots, it wasn't really something that was going to hold their interest for a long period of time. And so there's a lot of investment that goes into creating these great pilots. And if they don't stick around in the military, then you're not maximizing return on that investment. And so they stop the process. And so it's sort of an interesting example to me. And so I think it's a fundamental error. And I think it's something that really destroys the discourse around why we should be creating diversity, for the diversity of experiences, and who actually qualifies, and why we might choose people that look differently than ourselves in order to achieve that diversity, and yet still meet all of the qualifications of the job. It's because it's a threshold. I personally believe that it's a responsibility for us to seek that diversity. But the argument that I'm trying to make is that even if you disagree with me from a political standpoint, it still makes a lot of sense. And so I guess what I'm hopeful is that despite what your prejudices and your biases might be, that you can look beyond those to actually see that there's a rationale to it that makes sense in this world. And a matter of fact, even if you are one who believes in diversity just for diversity's sake, I still think you should think about all of this other, because I do think that these people that we're talking about in terms of greater inclusion are as qualified, and certainly more qualified than some, just as like in anything, there's this wide degree of variance. But this is not charity. This is meritocracy, but it's viewing meritocracy in the proper way, in my opinion. And so I think it's a responsibility for those that are in leadership positions and others to actually stop and reflect what's driving, sort of their reaction to this, and so I fundamentally believe, that people should be anti-racist, not just be not racist. And being anti-racist means, in my opinion, and this really is, the same thing. It's anti-misogynistic, and it's anti-Semitic, and it's anti-whatever, anti-homophobic. It's actively countering that. It's not just not being that yourself. It's actually taking active measures in order to rectify the past inequities. And I think that there's a rationale to do it, not only from a moral perspective, but it's because that people are using incorrect rationality, in my opinion. And I think that as leaders, as people who are potentially responsible for hiring and for increasing the diversity, we need to check our own biases and be willing to be wrong, and to be self-aware, and to admit that this only creates a better world by seeking out and actively implementing this diversity. So I thought it might be worthwhile to speak with somebody that has really lived and breathed this stuff. So I've invited Hugh Molotsi, who's the founder and CEO of a messaging platform called Ujama up in Silicon Valley. And he was also an innovation leader at Intuit. He worked at Intuit for 2 decades, and actually wrote all about that in a book called The Entrepreneur's Journey. So, startup founder, corporate innovator, author. Uh, who better to speak to than that? So I'm joined now by my friend and co-entrepreneur and co-innovator Hugh Molotsi. Hugh Molotsi is CEO and founder of a startup called Ujami. Is that right? Pronounce that right? Ujama.
Yes.
And this is after, boy, over 2 decades at Intuit, where he was head of innovation. And of course, Intuit is rather well known for being one of those large enterprises that does innovation pretty darn well. So we'll probably end up touching on that a little bit, because that's no matter what I do, I tend towards the entrepreneurial journey and the innovation side as well. But I wanted to, sort of in my, whatever one wants to call my style of my rants, I'm sort of infamous, maybe, we're not quite infamous, but on my path of being infamous for my rants. And so I want to get, your sort of first take on my rant on diversity.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Brant, and thanks for having me today. Diversity and inclusion is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Back in 2004, I was invited to serve on Intuit's Diversity Council, which was made up of a number of executive leaders from around the company, with the goal of how can we create a more diverse and inclusive culture at Intuit. And really through that journey, I personally learned a lot. But of course, as being a person of color myself, the diversity and inclusion is something that is near and dear to me, and obviously has been a part of my journey. But I think one of the most important lessons I learned, in the time I was at Intuit and thinking and doing a lot of work around diversity, was really that this notion we used of an iceberg metaphor. That, a lot of times when people hear diversity, they think of, racial quotas, or, how do we do better around gender? And we say, yes, those things, race and gender are important aspects of diversity, but they're really what we would say are the things that are above the waterline, if you think about the iceberg metaphor. But as we know, icebergs, there's much more going underneath the water. And that is the same when it comes to diversity. If we think about who we are as human beings, what's much more profound than just our gender and our skin color are things like, what's our religion, what was our upbringing, our culture, our sexual orientation. And these are the types of things that you won't necessarily discover about a person until you start to talk to them and engage with them. And then they're willing to start to share, well, look, here's my journey, here's what's happened to me. And an example is we would have it into it, these things we call journey line activities, where everybody draws a journey line of their life and just describes some of the most important things that happened in their lives. And what was very interesting to me is I remember doing that activity with this diversity council that had just formed. And during that activity, we found that they were 3 different people who had children with special needs. And what was shocking about that is I would have never known that until they had shared that about their journey lines. And as you can imagine, that is a very important factor that impacts their lives. But it's not necessarily, again, something that would come up And yet, at Intuit, when we were thinking about creating an inclusive, diverse culture, it's really about making sure that people can bring all these aspects of who they are to work, in part because we don't want people to feel like they have to hide anything about themselves, because that we see as an impediment to bring out your best work. But also, and this is what you touched on in your rant, I didn't think it's really a rant, but you touched on this as well, which is these different perspectives actually make us much, much better as a team. And especially when you're building product, you're going to build much better products when you have broad perspectives that, certainly just an individual is not going to have on their own with just their limited set of life experiences. So, so the most important thing when you talk about diversity and inclusion, and I think you were hitting on this isn't something we just do because it is politically correct, or we just have to, we have to fit in with the crowd, what everybody's doing. No, this is really about how we build much, much more effective companies, how we build much better products, and yes, ultimately how we also are trying to build a better world.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, and I think it's what gets lost in I guess people getting upset about it and the anger and sort of the knee-jerk reaction to it is that is really why it's beneficial to do it. I mean, we can just simply make a case that teams should be more diverse in order to create better products. I think that the world has changed a bit. I think that we're in a period of uncertainty, not only because of the pandemic, but just because the digital transformation means that we're trying to sell products to millions of end users or millions of small businesses, or even if it's fewer big companies, that's who they have to serve down the road. And so the products themselves need to go to a diverse audience if our businesses are going to be successful. And so that's one obvious reason to then have diversity in building the. But I also think it's just this complexity. I think that it's very difficult for us now with our village brains to understand all of this information that we get from all over the world endlessly. And so what we require, I think this is the rise of agile teams generally, we require teamwork in order to understand these larger contexts, in order for us to understand needs better and produce better products as well. And of course, again, I would just simply argue that if you're bringing different perspectives in building that context, you're going to have a better picture, which was actually my evoking the lineman and the elephant metaphor. And so I think that we can make this case without getting into, the quotas and all of that.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think a lot of people, even if they intellectually will agree that diverse teams are stronger teams, why it probably doesn't resonate at a visceral level. And so there's work to do where we have to shift that over time. But, one of the stories I like to share was, one of the products that I was associated with that was successful, that I won an innovation award for at Intuit, was something called QuickBooks Simple Start. And what we were trying to solve with that product was, QuickBooks over time, even though it had started as let's build a simple bookkeeping product that you don't have to understand accounting, you're just running a business and you can use. It started that way, but over time, as we had added more and more features, we had this epiphany of, oh my goodness, now it's become pretty complicated. And a lot of simple business users trying to use it would open up this app and go, oh my God, I'm confused, what do I do? And so we wanted to address that problem. And so I was leading the development of that product. We had built a bunch of prototypes. At Intuit, we used to have these very world-class usability labs. So we'd bring people in to try and use it. And everything we were doing was just failing. And I remember one particular meeting where we were all together. There was a woman called Erica Kinlan. She was a user researcher. So she was leading the meeting and was trying to brainstorming ideas. But then, all these ideas were throwing around. But I remember there was this woman, her name was Alice Hugh, and she wasn't a particularly vocal member of the team. But I remember she just blurted out, "What about money in, money out?" And it was one of those moments I'll never forget, because it just resonated. Everybody was like, "Oh, I've just been missing this point." And I share that because I consider myself to be a pretty smart person, a smart product guy, and I was working with a lot of smart people. But I don't know we would have hit on that insight if we didn't have this broad, diverse team that was working on this problem together. And I think for me, that is at least the one moment in my life where I really got to appreciate team, because look, here was a problem we were struggling with, but it took somebody with a different perspective. Wasn't even somebody who had deep accounting knowledge, but somebody who could really resonate with the businesses who were struggling to use the product, and came up with this whole theme that we ended up running with and making the product work.
Yeah, that's a story. I think it's, I guess is my own experience as a leader. Again, the world changed a bit, requires different skills. And so as leaders, I think it's more important for us to be able to listen and learn. And I feel like diversity around me helps me learn, and that can only make me a better leader. So I guess I think that the number of benefits, can just, stacks up as tall as an iceberg. So I think I have another rant. I guess it's nice that you don't think that they're rants, but it rhymes with Brant, so it's important. This idea that people struggle with the difference between micro and macro. And so micro is really what it's about me and what benefits me, and macro is about, well, what's better for anything larger than me, which could be only as large as a team, but could it also then be a company, and it could be a city, and it could be a region, it could be on it. And I think it's difficult for people to differentiate that there might be something that's better for the team or the company versus what happens to me. I think that the sort of that knee-jerk reaction where you sort of see this stuff online, and I would guess you've probably seen it more than me, is that people complaining like, I lost my job because of these diversity programs. Like, I was the one who was more qualified and I lost the job because of diversity. And I think that it's a confused take for a number of reasons. One is that diversity should be acceptable as a qualification for a company to be able, like, I'm striving for diversity, it makes my company better. And if we really even wanted to go there, we could make an argument that if my fiduciary responsibility is to maximize value to shareholders, among others, then diversity is actually going to do that. There's been tons of evidence out there that demonstrates that. But I touch on the rant, qualifications are like a minimum viable product. It's a threshold, not a continuum. That's so right. Once you got your new users on Ujamaa, it doesn't mean that you immediately now go and add a bunch of more users so that your product is even better to them. It's actually keep them engaged, keep them happy while you figure out how to get more, right?
That's exactly.
And so you're beyond minimum viable product, but the minimum viable product is to get those people past the threshold so that they're using the product. I'm not then trying to figure out which are more engaged others. I need to do other things to grow my business. And I think it's the same thing in jobs. I think we try to make this, and we try to make it so the hiring manager isn't the one that has to read all the resumes or whatever, but these processes we put in place tend to be very quantifiable. And so if I had a 740 on my SATs, that means I'm more qualified to go to a state college than somebody that's at 600, even though the requirement is 540. No, it may be that the 740 is like not qualified to go to that school. So I guess I'll pause there. You've done a lot of hiring in your career, so I'm kind of curious on what your take is on that.
Yeah, this is a fantastic point you're bringing up. And the thing I would start off by saying is people need to first recognize that even this notion of qualification is subjective. Somebody had to come up and say, okay, when we're hiring for a job, we have to think about, okay, what are the requirements for the job? And often that's where the problems begin, because so I started out life as a software developer. Obviously I've done a lot of things. I ended up in executive leadership. Now to JAMA, I'm being a software developer again. But if I'm trying to hire a software development, I'll tell you what is the knee-jerk reaction when I'm putting those qualifications together, is I want to hire somebody who is just like me. Because I'm great. Here are all the things I know. Here's what I want somebody to do. And of course, as we've been talking about, that's probably not the right qualifications for somebody I would hire on a team. In fact, I probably want somebody to complement me, not somebody who's just going to be exactly like me. But you mentioned the SAT example. I remember many years ago when this was a big topic in California, when they were removing. There was this whole debate about race-based quotas, and there was a proposition that went along with it. But I remember the Mercury News had an article where they highlighted two students. One was a white student who grew up in an upper middle class home, went to a very good school, had tutors along the way, all the benefits, or you would say privileges, of having a good upbringing. And scored a particular SAT score, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a good score. And then there was another student who was I believe was either an immigrant himself or was a child of immigrants, but his parents did not speak English. So he grew up in with English as a second language, grew up speaking Spanish, and went to not the best schools. Parents never had money for extra tutoring, whatever the case is. But his SAT score and this other student who was featured, the SAT scores were very close. The first one had a slightly higher score. But when you put in the context of their backgrounds, it was very clear which of the students had overcome much, much more adversity and was much more impressive to say, wow, you went through all of that and were able to get this SAT score versus the other one. And so I think the first thing that people just have to realize is just a little more humility around this notion of I'm qualified, because again, it's subjective. It's typically whatever qualifications you put on a page are only going to be a slice of what you're actually going to bring to the table. And a lot of times, these qualifications often have no bearing on the work you're going to actually do. One of the things that we're seeing in the US and maybe even broadly across the world is this over-credentializing of job requirements. At Intuit, we had to go through this. For the longest time at Intuit, when we were hiring product managers, we would only hire product managers who went to the top business schools. So literally, there was a handful of 5 schools that we recruited from. And these were super bright people. Some of these are still my friends today that I worked with, and I can attest to very, very bright folks. And they would come to work at Intuit to be product managers, working on QuickBooks features. But what we started to learn over time is that there was a mismatch. If I've just gone through an expensive business school, gone into debt, and now I've gotten a job, my mind is about promotion and getting, to the executive level and making the big bucks. It's not necessarily about, okay, how do I get a feature in QuickBooks to work better and do the work of understanding how the product works, understanding customers, doing all that, elbow grease. I'm thinking, I just got an MBA. I'm going to hire somebody else to do that. So we had this mismatch. And so literally that was a case of where we were hiring people who were, unfortunately for the most part, wrong for the actual job that we were hiring them to do. So this point that you're making cannot be emphasized enough, which is, don't focus so much on the qualification that you lose the forest for the trees. The other thing I'll also say about it is, because you mentioned the difference between the micro and the macro, I actually see them as being maybe not that different. What the real difference is, are you looking at things on a short-term basis or a long-term basis? Because I think what tends to be good for the team, good for the company, good for society is ultimately going to be good for you. And you have to believe that to really, in the end of the day, be able to support diversity and inclusion. If we had fewer people living in impoverished communities, fewer people going to bad schools, what does that mean? It means fewer people that are on welfare, fewer people who are leading lives of crime, fewer people in prisons. It means more customers who can afford to buy products, so it means a better economy. Ultimately, this is better for all of us in an economy or in a world in which things are getting better. All boats should rise in that scenario. And so I feel like that's often what's missing. Somebody is saying, well, maybe I didn't get this particular job offer, and that's because of some kind of diversity initiative, rather than thinking about, well, what does this mean in terms of the context of society, and what does that mean for me long term? Because long term, I'm going to live in this society, I'm going to have a family, I'm going to have children that I'm bringing up, et cetera, and we want to believe that it's going to be a better world for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, there's still the difference between the micro and the macro. It's just that hoping people can wear both hats. And I think that's like, the macro hat is that this is going to be better for society and therefore better for me long term. But the thing is that in the micro world, in that individual's world, they might already have a family, and they might already be in debt as well, and they might already have all of these economic problems. And so in order for them and they get to pursue their own happiness as well. So to get those people to about the macro, to me, is probably not a path towards change. As a society, we need to be protecting, obviously all people, and their economic viability and their ability to get jobs. Yeah. So I guess I think that it's unlikely to get those people to be able to step back because they are in the situation that they're in. And so I can understand that. I can actually empathize with that. But as anybody that is a leader who is making choices, or as a leader who's making policies, I need to understand that individual and what drives their point of view. But I have to policies that are beneficial more to the society in general. And so that's the macro side of it. That micro person actually doesn't really have any control over that more macro position. I think that in the end, their argument is just wrong. They were not qualified for the job because the qualifications went way beyond these characteristics that were different than what these characteristics were that you just described in the poorly written job description. I think that, in the West in particular, I think we focus on trying to automate things. We try to create systems out of everything. We want to have a form that can be filled out. We want the HR person to be able to put it into a tool, and we want the tool to churn out the right candidates. And it's like we want to have as little interaction as possible.
That's right.
From a human perspective, which is, you know, kind of crazy, especially when we're hiring. And I think that in the end, I mean, I don't really know what the answer is to that, except that the hiring manager who maybe has developed some new leadership skills around empathy and vulnerability and empowerment and some of these things that are important in the modern world, maybe there's a way to build an HR system that includes their input a little bit more in how to build a team that'll be most effective. But the moment we put it into a process and those criteria, like you say, are subjective, then, you know, we miss that human element even in the hiring part. It reminds me of one of the myths. I don't know if you ever saw this. You were at this Lean Startup conference, but I did the 5 myths of startups. And one of them was, go hire A players, right? You hear that all the time in the startup world. You got to hire A players. And it's like, no, the bell curve, that's like a very small segment of the population. Not everybody gets to hire A. Matter of fact, they're probably all at the big tech giants, right? And so what we have to do is, I love the way you described the matching. It's the matching that makes an A player. If you could take B players and make them A players because you've put them in the right match. And a matter of fact, you can do the opposite. That's the story, right? Is we took A players and we put them in the wrong place and they were no longer A players.
That's right. Yeah, no, that point you just made is what's critical. I mean, I definitely believe, you know, this is something I say all the time, is that every human being has superpowers. And by superpowers, I mean things that they do, you know, better than 95% of the world's population. The problem is not all of us are aware of what our superpower is. And very few of us get the privilege of applying that superpower to the work, you know, that we're being paid to do as a daily job. And so to your point, an A player is just somebody who is, that match has happened where, you know, I've gotten this job and I'm actually getting to apply the things I'm really good at that job. And yes, that's going to make you a star. And if somebody is, you know, perceived to be B player or just somebody who's failing at the job, you know, it's not a testament that they are, you know, a worthless person to society. It's just often that, you know, that person hasn't found the right role in life. And it's a tough question because, you know, it often requires this journey for you to discover, oh, here is the thing that I do really, really well. You know, I've worked with people who were not great engineers, but went on to be great managers or went on to be great at a whole different thing other than technology. And that's just part of that discovery process. But I think to your point about hiring, you know, I mean, hiring is so important to companies, both small and large. And as you said, you know, it's so important that you'd actually want to spend a lot of time on it, but you reach this practical issue of, but I got work to do. So how do I minimize the time? How do I delegate it to other folks? And that's, of course, where a lot of these problems creep in. But, you know, the reality too of, you know, we talk about the requirements and the process and things like that. The reality too is that ultimately when if you were to inspect every person who got hired, you'd find that in many cases, oh yeah, that requirement they didn't meet, but oh no, we know this person is great anyway. Or, oh yeah, this person happened to be a friend of, you know, somebody I worked with who I really trust, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you find that yes, there's a process, but maybe, you know, less than half the time is the process actually followed to the letter.
Yeah, yeah. I could probably do a whole nother show. Maybe I'll have to do a rant on hiring and my own. I just really don't know that I'm very good at it. But so like lots of stories there of hirings that don't necessarily go well, or that I don't, it's not even the hiring, it's also maybe the letting go. I mean, I actually think that I maybe work too hard trying to find what the right role is when that person has essentially told me over time, there is no role here. So, but I'd love to transition here really quickly, maybe as we get towards the end here, and maybe you could talk a little bit about Ujamaa and what your goal is there, and maybe throw in there what your perspective is on diversity and how it relates to you being a first-time CEO founder and your journey at Ujamaa.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. And it's actually a good segue because it really ties together with what we've been talking about. So, again, I had a long career at Intuit, and I feel very blessed. Intuit's a great company and worked with really great people. As you know, I got to write the book, The Entrepreneur's Journey, with Jeff Zayas, one of my favorite people in the world. Because of some of the good work we did together in creating in an environment where people could bring their best selves to work and be empowered to work on their own ideas. So great career. And when I decided to leave Intuit, I wasn't actually thinking I was going to start a startup. In fact, quite the opposite. I was more thinking to slow things down a little bit, work with other startups because I enjoyed doing that. And do some board work, but it would also give me more time to spend with my daughters, who, when I left Intuit, were much younger. But at the same time, I was very interested in this issue of diversity, and specifically how this concept of unconscious bias. And just to speak about that for a second, unconscious bias, it's what I tell people is, if you're a person of color, you come to work in Silicon Valley, you're unlikely to run into an overt racist, but you're very likely to run into unconscious bias. So you're not likely to run into somebody who's going to call you the N-word. At least that hasn't happened to me in a professional setting. But certainly I can talk about stories where I felt that unconscious bias, where people just assume that you don't belong. And this was best, I feel like, illustrated by a conversation that Van Jones relayed that he had with Prince. When Trayvon Martin was killed, Prince's observation was very interesting. He said, part of the problem here is when people see a black person in a hoodie, they see a thug. But if they see a white person in a hoodie, they see Mark Zuckerberg. So the solution is we need more black Mark Zuckerbergs. And that's, by the way, what led Van Jones to start an organization called Yes We Code, which teaches inner city youth how to code. The whole idea was, let's get more of more people of color into the tech sector, and hopefully we can get more, again, ultimately more black Mark Zuckerbergs. And so that resonated with me, especially. There's a famous quote by some VC who said, I know a successful startup founder when I see one, right? And of course, that is loaded with unconscious bias because, people—
More than one VC, I think, man, more than one.
Yes. So so overcoming that is tough because, again, when somebody sees a person of color, again, they're not necessarily going to think this is somebody who is going to help my business succeed. And in fact, the inconvenient truth is, if you ask the average layperson, tell me a successful startup founder, they're probably going to name a white male person. We know Jeff Bezos, we know Bill Gates, we know Mark Zuckerberg, we know the Google founders, et cetera. But okay, now you're starting to think of, can you name a woman? Can you name a person of color? An average layperson will probably have a hard time with that. And that translates then ultimately, even in a corporate environment, even if you get out of the startup world, and now you're thinking about, I need to hire somebody who's going to take our product group or technology group to the next level. Not necessarily going to think of somebody who doesn't fit that picture. And by the way, the most insidious thing about unconscious bias, it's not just how the majority view the minority, it's how we view ourselves. And so overcoming it is really important by having just more of these examples that are well known, where people can, in their mind, start to say, oh, okay, actually, here's a different example of something that worked. And so I became very passionate about this. In fact, I was trying to encourage people to say, we need more Black founders of tech startups, because that's going to really make a big difference here. And so when I left Intuit, I had this realization that, of course, for a Black person to start a startup is a much more difficult proposition than, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, they left college in the middle to go and do their startups because, ultimately they had safety nets. If things didn't work out for them, they could probably go back home, they could probably go back to college. That was not the issue. But imagine if you are the first person in your family who has made it to college, made it to Harvard, and you call home to say, hey, I'm going to quit and I'm going to do this startup thing. It's not going to be met with a lot of support, and especially you're being counted on to graduate, get the six-figure job, and probably help your siblings and other folks who are behind you. And so that makes this idea of people starting their own startup a much, much more difficult proposition. And on the other hand, for me, I left Intuit, I had a small nest egg, and I realized, here I am preaching for people to do that. Why am I not doing it myself? And so that is ultimately one of the reasons. There were a few others, but one of the reasons that compelled me, even though, like I said, I really wasn't, had it in my mind to do it, I decided I should. But the other thing that was also in my mind was, in Silicon Valley, we tend to create solutions that are for people who are, like us, which in general are people who are affluent. And so in spite of the fact that technology has done so many wonderful things, you'll find that people who are low income, hourly workers, there's not been a lot of technology that's been created to improve their lives. And again, I think a lot of it is tied to the fact that there's just a lot less diversity in startup founders. And specifically with Ujamaa, I wanted to address this problem of how parents today are overburdened. Parenting is much more challenging. People tend not to have extended family support as they're raising young kids. And the typical Silicon Valley solution is, well, let's create a gig economy company, an Uber for kids, a babysitting type of company where you can hire folks to come on demand to meet your needs. But the problem with those solutions, not only do you have the struggles of the Uber, making an Uber business model work, but it's just that you have to be fairly affluent to be able to afford to pay somebody to do that. And I felt like there's a community approach where you just tie people together, where parents could be connected to other parents and then they would support each other. And then that would work even better. And of course, you wouldn't have to be affluent. It's something that could work for everybody in the economic pyramid. And so that to me was also something I was very passionate about. Let's build something that's not your typical Silicon Valley approach, but something that really strives to reach everybody in society, and especially the people who are most marginalized and most in need. So that was a lot of the drivers to why Ujamaa exists today.
Nice. Well, that's great. I appreciate that story. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you, or how can they help?
Well, I encourage everybody to check out Ujamaa. Our website is ujamaa.co. You can certainly reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. And I'd love to hear from folks as well. Also, if you start Ujamaa and reach out to me or Ujamaa, I'll definitely respond and connect with you that way. We've expanded Ujamaa to not just focus on parenting. Now we're using it as a way to connect members of community with each other. We have a marketplace. So if you have a side hustle, you can actually sell stuff on Ujamaa as well. So definitely people check it out. And of course, we're improving. We have new builds of our apps almost every week. And so feedback and getting more folks who are passionate about what we're doing is going to be really helpful to us.
Awesome. I'm going to check it out myself. I hope maybe you guys can be a replacement for Facebook.
It's funny you say that, but that's part of the feedback we've been getting because, I didn't start off thinking about trying to replace Facebook, but certainly what we're seeing is on Facebook right now, probably the most compelling thing that's going on are these Facebook groups. and there are many large ones on there. But what we're seeing is, Facebook, because of their business model, they're often at odds with what their users want. And so for that reason, these groups are not necessarily the group organizers are not necessarily getting all the things they need to run those groups well or to serve their members well. And so, so we're learning from that, and through JAMA, hopefully we'll do a better job for these large groups as well.
That's awesome. Well, everybody should go check that out. I know I will. And Hugh, yeah. I really appreciate you coming on and giving your perspective and the stories. It was really awesome. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for letting me pitch JAMA during this time.
All right, we'll talk later.
All right, thanks, Brant. Take care.
Hey, thanks for listening to Brant's Rant. If we're choosing capitalism here as a society, then let's make it work for a better world. If you'd like to join me as we redefine capitalism for the 21st century, go to beatcoop.co/D4A. Also, if you have a pressing issue that you're facing in your innovation group, your product group, your startup, and want to join me on video, see the link below. Subscribe, like, see you next time.